What's up everyone, Soldier First Class here. In today's mission, to celebrate the arrival of the Shadow of the Erdtree DLC for Elden Ring, we're going to list the top 10 hardest SoulsBorne bosses. The SoulsBorne series is famous for its brutal challenge and incredible boss designs, and for redefining what challenges and accomplishments mean inside of an interactive media. From its first entry, Demon Souls, to its most recent entry in Elden Ring, From Software has not only created an entire genre of video games, it's influenced the video game industry in ways that few companies ever have. For this list, we'll be discussing only the toughest, most brutal challenges that the SoulsBorne series has to offer. We also won't disqualify bosses for any cheese methods or boundary-breaking glitches that the average player wouldn't experience. This keeps all bosses on an even playing field, since even some of the hardest bosses in the entire series have some of the finest cheese known to man that can trivialize them under the right conditions. But before we get started, if you enjoy this list, be sure to light the bonfire on that like button and subscribe to the channel and set notifications to all so you never miss an upload. With that out of the way, let's get right into the list. Number 10, Allfather, Sekiro Shadows Die Twice. I first played Sekiro when the game first launched, and after getting past the Chained Ogre, I deleted the game and decided it wasn't for me. I then messaged Sony for my money back, at which point they told me to, and I quote, "Eat our asses, get good, LOL." Which I thought was kind of unprofessional, but whatever. Fast forward to 2022, and I was riding high on having beaten Malenia in Elden Ring, and decided to give Sekiro another shot. I got good, completed the game, and even sacrificed my soul to get the platinum. But one of the largest roadblocks on that journey was Allfather. Having defeated the older version of Al atop Ashina Castle, I assumed this fight wouldn't be that bad, but per usual, I was wrong. Between an all-new arsenal of attacks and extremely aggressive AI, this younger version known as Allfather was absolutely brutal, and I couldn't begin to even tell you how many attempts this took for me. Even after I did win, I felt like a part of me was left in that boss arena. For leaving to go get milk and not coming back, Allfather settles in at number 10 on this list, and number 1 as the worst father in all of SoulsBorne. Number 9, Black Dragon Kalameet, Dark Souls. I'm not gonna lie to you, this boss fight beat my ass several times, maybe even more times than I care to admit. Black Dragon Kalameet, in my opinion, is the hardest boss in the first Dark Souls and of the Artorias of the Abyss DLC. And this is a DLC that includes both Artorias and Manus as boss fights. To even safely fight Kalameet, you'll need to complete the questline that gets a blind giant named Hawkeye Goff to fire a massive arrow to knock it down a peg. Which, by the way, Goff might have the biggest flex voice line in the entire game. This dude is blind as fuck and states, "Of little help to thee, I'm afraid," and then proceeds to shoot the hardest boss in the game out of the air like a trick shot he saw on Dude Perfect. It's not impossible to defeat Kalameet without Goff's assistance, but you'd have to be one sick, self-loathing bastard to pull this off. The problem with Kalameet is that he has a counter for just about any strategy. Stay at a distance, he'll breathe magic-infused fire at you. Stay in close, and he can stomp, claw, grab, and breathe fire directly underneath him. He also has a devastating move that if afflicted, the player suffers from a temporary debuff that doubles the damage the player takes from Kalameet's attacks. While better strategies have come out over the years since the DLC released, that doesn't change the fact that Kalameet is downright brutal and well deserving of the number 9 spot on this list. Number 8, Maliketh, the Black Blade, Elden Ring. Elden Ring wasn't the first game in the series that I played, but it definitely was the first one that I finished. And one major obstacle in my way that even with summons I had a major struggle with was Maliketh, the Black Blade. This Keeper of Destined Death also happens to be my second favorite fight in the entire game, and if it doesn't become painfully obvious by the end of this video, the harder the boss fight, typically the more I enjoy it. While that's definitely not always the case, thankfully Maliketh fills the difficulty wish and then some. The start of the fight is fairly simple, and you may recognize the Beast Clergyman from the Caelid Bestial Sanctum if you did the Deathroot side quest, but it's when his second form arrives that the real fun begins. Not only does he become Yoda from Revenge of the Sith, his attacks also add a burn effect. While this is active, a portion of your health bar is rendered useless, and you also lose health at a steady pace. While his moves are entirely dodgeable, it's the speed at which they come at you that makes this fight so difficult. It's also the fact that Maliketh jumps around the arena like a rat on crack, using the environment to his advantage, which is also another thing I really love. You can obtain the Blasphemous Claw as a way to counter a few of his attacks, but he's still just as brutal of a challenge regardless, and earns his number 9 spot and the number 2 best boy spot after Sif. Number 7, Sister Friede, Dark Souls 3. Sister Friede was introduced in the Ashes of Ariandel DLC for Dark Souls 3, and as is tradition, checks all the boxes for SoulsBorne DLC, providing the toughest challenges the games have to offer. While Dark Souls 3 gave us bosses whose delayed attacks are extremely deadly, it's her speed that gives even Dark Souls veterans no room to breathe. Sister Friede is the first 3-phase boss fight on this list, and if it weren't for how vulnerable she can be to backstabs, she'd probably be higher on this list. But that doesn't make her any less challenging, as you have to actually be skilled enough and know her moveset kit well enough to make use of this strategy. Her first phase is difficult, the second phase with Father Ariandel is much easier, and she'll be more defensive unless you get too close to her, and then her third phase is when the real Dark Souls 3 begins. Her third phase is absolutely brutal, and due to Dark Souls 3's combat engine, rivals maliketh in speed and aggression. She also makes use of invisible teleportation, frostbite, and black flame, so for those familiar with Priscilla from Dark Souls, you'll recognize her signature weapon and attacks. Sister Friede is one of those bosses that even after learning her moveset, I still often struggle with, leaving her at number 7 on the list. Number 6, Darkeater Midir, Dark Souls 3. The second Dark Souls 3 boss on this list, Darkeater Midir on any given day could be ranked even higher. Between magic fire breathing, his massive HP pool, and the only weakness being his head, this 2-phase boss fight is a war of attrition between this legendary dragon and the player. I honestly lost track of how many times it took me to defeat Midir, because this dragon destroyed me so many times I thought he was going to brand his name into my ass to prove ownership. The first half of this fight is entirely manageable, but it's when he starts throwing heavy-hitting magic at you that it becomes a death march. The other problem is that the same run underneath the large enemies and chip away at them strategy doesn't work here. Its legs and arms don't take near the damage that the head does, and there are only a few opportunities after certain moves to be able to damage its head. You can technically win without hitting its head, but you're in for one of the longest boss fights ever if you do, because you hardly do any damage and his health pool is massive. He also likes to breathe fire at you, even if you're in close quarters, and his magic attacks later in the fight are absolutely devastating. Bring in your lightning-imbued weapon, attack the head, and grind out one of the hardest earned boss encounters in Dark Souls 3. Number 5, Orphan of Kos, Bloodborne. You knew it, I knew it. We all knew Orphan of Kos was going to be on this list. I just didn't know where, and top 5 is definitely where it belongs, but I just didn't know which part of the top 5. My history with Orphan of Kos is complicated because I was a little over-leveled in preparation, and while I barely made it out of this fight by the skin of my teeth, I did defeat this boss in one attempt. In fact, Lady Maria took me more attempts than Orphan did, but just because I only took one attempt doesn't mean I don't see the punishing difficulty of this fight, because trust me, I found out real quick. While the first phase is entirely manageable on its own, it's when he sprouts wings and becomes rabidly aggressive that the real fight begins. Throwing every possible move the Orphan has at its arsenal, including its shrimp placenta, Orphan is an absolute nightmare befitting its classification as a great one. The thing I love about Orphan, and something you'll see throughout this list, is that I love when bosses make you do the opposite of what you've been conditioned to do for most of, or the entirety of the game. Orphan is unique in that some of his attacks are set up that the game wants you to dodge toward him instead of away from him. This was really hard to break for me, as Bloodborne was the final game in the series that I completed, and the entire time I'd been conditioned to dodge away from, or left or right of every boss's movesets. But Orphan said, "Nah man, fuck that, you're gonna come to me you little bitch," and then proceeds to punish you for your transgressions. So grab your best hunter's tools, maybe think about leveling up a little bit, and then pray to the Great Ones that you can take out the Orphan and one of the hardest bosses in all of SoulsBorne. Number 4, the Nameless King, Dark Souls 3. Ah, the Nameless King. I had a hard time ranking this one. On one hand, I didn't want 3 consecutive Dark Souls 3 bosses, but I also had way more trouble with this boss than I ever thought about having with Orphan of Kos. The Nameless King is also my favorite fight in Dark Souls 3 and the entire SoulsBorne series, rivaled only by Malenia from Elden Ring. So number 4 felt justifiable, as this boss is not only epic, has great lore, and a really cool boss arena and theme, but it's also one of the most brutal fights in all of SoulsBorne. With his lightning-imbued attacks, high damage output, and delayed attacks, the Nameless King is truly king of the battlefield. This guy rides in on a dragon named King of the Storm like a total badass, and then you'll have to beat the hardest boss of Phase 1, the camera. Once you've defeated the King of the Storm, the Nameless King drains the dragon's power into his spear, and the real boss fight begins. Even on my best attempts at this boss, I never felt an ounce of safety. My adrenaline was flowing, and my heart was pounding. So for giving me the same feelings I get from seeing a double cheeseburger, the Nameless King sits at number 4 on the list, and number 1 in my heart. Number 3, Demon of Hatred, Sekiro Shadows Die Twice. Much like I talked about with Orphan of Kos, I love when bosses cause you to think outside of the box and break all the conditioning you've had up to the point of facing them. With Sekiro, you're conditioned to stand and fight, deflect and block attacks, and look for advantages. Demon of Hatred shows up and is like, "Do you even deflect, bro?" and then proceeds to barely give you attacks to deflect. The key to this fight is almost constant movement, dodging, and jumping, something that every other fight in the game actively punishes you for. But that's not all that makes Demon of Hatred one of the most legendary challenges to overcome, as its massive amount of health health and death blow counters make for a much longer fight, even for a game full of long fights. But I'll let you in on a little secret if you don't want to actually face this boss. You can actually cheese this fight without ever swinging your sword, but it requires a very precisely timed jump and grab onto a building in the arena. But this will cause the Demon of Hatred to run off the cliff next to it in pursuit of his piece of cheese, giving you a free victory. I've defeated this boss normally, but you'll need the item he drops to platinum the game, so I definitely use this to speed up the platinum process on subsequent playthroughs. While this boss is entirely optional, as are a few of the bosses on this list already, that doesn't change the fact that it's one of the most mechanically difficult boss fights in the entire SoulsBorne series. Which earns it number 3 on the list, which lets you know the final 2 are a death march of epic proportions. Number 2, Malenia, Blade of Miquella, Elden Ring. So we're at the top 2, and honestly, these could have been switched. Depending on the day, Malenia is easily the hardest boss in the entirety of SoulsBorne, and just so we're clear, wood. Over the past few years, people have found several strategies that work in defeating her, including summoning the legendary Let Me Solo Her, but that changes nothing about how difficult she is. What makes Malenia so difficult is her aggressive AI, insane combos such as Waterfowl Dance, and the fact that she heals with every single strike. And really, her only one weakness is that she is very easily staggered by heavy hits. One false move and one massive combo from her either ends in your death or her health bar being almost completely refilled, or both. All of her attacks do insane amounts of damage, and she's no stranger to one-shotting you. When she rises into the air, she's loading up her Waterfowl Dance, and your best course of action is to run as far away as possible, and then when her third set of attacks begins, dodge roll into her and get away from her on the other side before the fourth goes off. And then there's her second phase, and again, definitely wood. Unleashing the Goddess of Rot phase, Malenia has a smaller health pool in this phase, but several moves now inflict the terrible Scarlet Rot status effect. You'll want to actively avoid these moves if you want any hope of defeating her. Not only does her Waterfowl Dance become even more potent, she also raises into the air and unleashes ghost-like clones of herself to attack you. Defeating Malenia is one of my proudest video game accomplishments ever, and with good reason. She was the first Souls super boss I had ever defeated, but to be honest, I did so as a filthy casual and used Mimic Tear and Rivers of Blood to do so. In subsequent playthroughs, I've defeated her with more traditional methods, but you know what they say, you never forget your first. Before we get to number 1, let's look at some honorable mentions. Fume Knight, Dark Souls 2. Ornstein and Smough, Dark Souls. Guardian Ape, Sekiro, Shadows Die Twice. Ludwig, the Accursed, Bloodborne. Number 1, Isshin, the Sword Saint, Sekiro, Shadows Die Twice. I think it was pretty obvious when Malenia was number 2 that Isshin the Sword Saint was going to be number 1, but in my opinion, deservedly so. With Malenia, you can use a larval tier to respec, grind some smithing stones, and come back with new weapons and strategies to tackle her. But with Isshin, you've only got the shinobi tools you've gotten throughout Sekiro's journey, and whatever prayer beads you've collected. Even with increased power, Sekiro balances the game in a way that you're only ever as strong as the game allows you to be at any certain point. You're also locked into one playstyle for the entire game, and while you should have gotten good with that single playstyle over the course of the game, Isshin is an entirely different monster. While his first phase is actually Genichiro Ashina, he still has 3 more phases after that, with each phase getting more insane. The only real relief you get with Isshin is if you make it to phase 4, and that's due to the lightning counter making it easier to defeat his final phase of the fight. But the trick is actually getting there. This is a true war of attrition with the most skilled and legendary swordsman in all of Ashina, and you'll have to conserve your healing and spirit emblems if you want to have a chance at making it through this war. Not only does Isshin wield his trusty blade, he also pulls out the Glocks and caps your ass, and then pulls out a spear for good measure. While you can bait certain attacks, one false swipe, one poor angle taken to get closer to him, and it's a run ender. Even in subsequent playthroughs, I've spent hours and hours trying to beat Isshin, and even victory feels hollow afterwards. I don't necessarily hate this fight, but I definitely dread it when I start getting close. For beating my ass for hours on end, Isshin the Sword Saint is the hardest boss in all of SoulsBorne. Do you agree with this list?
He's shit everywhere!
Let me know in the comment section below who you think are the hardest bosses in the entire SoulsBorne series. And if you enjoyed this list, light the bonfire on that like button, as your likes and comments help me battle the toughest boss on YouTube, the algorithm. Subscribe to the channel and turn those notifications to all so you never miss an upload. I'm Soldier First Class, and I'm on to the next mission. Later, guys.